The following podcast discusses topics about mental health struggles and illnesses, including depression, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, suicide, self-harm, and trauma. If you are sensitive to these topics or find them triggering, please continue listening with caution. If at any point the conversation is too much or you feel like you need to talk to someone, know that help is available. You can call the GBHWC 24-hour crisis hotline at 671-647-8833 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255.
Hello, and welcome to Everything's Cherry, a podcast where we have casual conversations about all things mental health related.
On this podcast, we share personal stories, advice from professionals, and other musings on how everything affects our mental health.
I'm Rizal.
And I'm CJ.
And in this episode, we're going to talk about media. And we're going to specifically be talking about mainstream, fiction media, like TV shows, movies, that kind of thing. And let's kind of talk about first, like, why this kind of thing is important. So for me, I'm just gonna say, like, if you remember from the first episode, like one thing that really sparked my advocacy for mental health and mental illness is that one of my family members, when they had an episode of psychosis, it was in the police blotter, and the last line of that article, like, before all of this, like, they just described it in detail, like, just very objective, but the very last line of the article was, "It is unclear how long this person has been out of the Department of Mental Health and Social Services," which is now the Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center. And that really just, like, it really angered me in a way, because, like, that's just not how it works. And it, like, really made me want to, as a filmmaker, as a person who is creative, do everything I can to sort of shift that narrative and get people to understand more about what it's like.
Right. And I think, the way media portrays mental health is so important, because for many of us, that's our first introduction to what mental health looks like. And, for people who, I guess, get the opportunity to never really deal with mental health all their lives, that may be the only look that they get about what mental health means to them. And so for me, it's really important because just like Roselle, like, I want to make sure that people, are understanding what mental health really looks like in the real world, because what we think mental health looks like can really affect how we treat people, that struggle with mental health. And I think for me too, as someone who started dealing with depression very early on in my teenage years, it's really important to have good media portrayals, because I definitely ran into some things growing up that would really trigger me. And, at the time, of course, not really understanding my depression too well, I didn't really know that was what was happening, that I was being triggered. And so I think it's so important to have these good portrayals of mental health, because many times we have, vulnerable teenagers and other people who watch it and can be severely affected by it. So, yeah, I think that's why it's important.
And I think that it's really... Let's just... get into it, I guess. The first thing, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Because, it was going to be kind of connected to what I was about to say. So let's just kind of, get into it. So one of the things that we're going to sort of talk about first is, kind of casual mentions of mental health and mental illnesses. It might not seem obvious the way that people kind of address mental health in media, but things just as simple as calling a person crazy or psycho just because they're acting out or acting a certain way, that in general, it's not okay, right? It makes it very much stigmatizes mental health, right? It's a person can only act a certain way, a person can only be acting out or be violent. They have to have a mental illness, right? That's what that says. That's what it says to people, and that's why people, when they are often diagnosed, they won't tell anybody, right? Or if they're struggling, they won't tell anybody because they don't want to be that person that people talk about that way, right? So
Right.
let's just kind of like talk about like just some instances where it's like sort of casually mentioned. I'm going to start the first one.
Yeah.
And then CJ, we can kind of go from there. Just go ahead and pipe in. So the
Right.
first one that I wanted to mention, right, is the show iCarly.
Love that show.
See, CJ, sorry. Freddie's mom is very neurotic, right? We all know this. If you grew up in our generation, you probably know this. It's on Netflix now, so I'm sure younger kids now know it now. And Sam calls her crazy. Like, literally, that is the name she calls her.
I don't even think I remember that. That's wild.
That's literally her name for Freddie's mom. And, like, is she super over the top and super, like, you know, whatever for Freddie? Sure. And like, this is a comedy show, so they're you know, that's focused on kids, so obviously they're not going to address like any kind of trauma that Freddie's mom may have had that has related to this, right? What that has, you know, like Freddie doesn't have a dad. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe it's something that happened with his dad, right? We don't know, and we're not gonna know because it's a kids comedy show, and usually the adults are portrayed in a certain way that makes them look incompetent, or like that the kids want to get away from them, and that's just like a common trope. But it's problematic, right? Because then kids can grow up thinking that it's okay to say that to people, right? Which is not what we want.
Right. It's not, because crazy should never be used as an insult or even just a modifier. Like, you know, yeah, that's not okay. And I didn't even realize that. I think I'd have to go and rewatch it.
Okay. Hey everyone, this is Rizal. I'm interrupting really quick because I am no longer 100% sure that Sam does nickname her crazy, actually. I did not have time to actually rewatch the series, but I was looking for it in like transcripts of the show, and I couldn't find Sam addressing Marissa Benson as crazy. So I don't know if that's true 100%. I feel in my heart that it is true because I feel like I've heard her say it, but I might be wrong. Full disclosure, I am an adult who has read fan fiction. Growing up, still do. And I think this is fanon. Like, I think this is like something that iCarly fans have done in fan fiction, just like allowing it to happen, which by the way is kind of problematic. The problem of calling people crazy still stands. There are some instances in iCarly that are problematic when it comes to the portrayal of people and calling them crazy. There are other examples of it. I just don't necessarily think that this is one of them, so I just wanted to make that very clear. Okay, I'm done. You can go back to listening now.
I think one of the casual mentions that we talked about off the record, we were talking about How I Met Your Mother, which I used to love that show. And I do say used to because this is a conversation for a different kind of podcast, but I've definitely learned that that show was a lot problematic with everything. I mean, you know, it was a good show of the time. It just, I don't think it aged well. And something we had talked about was the hot crazy scale that was I guess you'd call it a casual mention because it was kind of the focus of just one episode. And for those who have never watched How I Met Your Mother, the hot crazy scale is basically this scale that the character Barney came up with where, you know, if they are a certain level of like hotness, then it's okay if they're this certain level of crazy. And it's like a whole graph chart that I think they show from what I remember, like which,
you know,
yeah, which is like, at the time,
there's like a line, like if a girl is like above the line for any reason, like
then
it's not
right. Yeah, which is like at the time was like, oh, that's so funny, ha ha. But then you start to think and realize like it's really not okay. One, obviously, to objectify women like that, which is one of the biggest problems of the show. But you know, it's not okay to call girls crazy just because they don't, you know, fit into your expectations of them. And yeah, that's just another thing that sticks out to me as like casual mentions in media.
And like I'd like to add that like the show doesn't necessarily rectify this, but sort of addresses it later, when Mike Tyson is talking to Robin, and is like, well, let's think about the way the guy treats her. Maybe like the way he's treating her is making her act like a certain way, right? I mean, they use the word crazy. It's not the word that I would use, right? But like maybe what the way he's treating her is directly impacting the way that she's looking to seem like she's quote unquote crazy, right? And I don't think this, right? And I think I appreciate that they included it after the fact, but I mean, nobody thinks about that, right? Nobody's thinking about Mike Tyson talking to Robin with a baby in a strip club. They're thinking the popular thing is the hot crazy scale, which is the whole problem.
Right. Yeah, and you know, these casual mentions, they mean something.
Yeah. Um, let's see what else do we have. So, I mean, like they kind of like there's lots of examples where like people just kind of casually mention it, like in the Babysitters Club, the 2020 reboot. By the way, it's a great show. Like the
I need to
writing in
watch
that
that.
show is super ace. Like it's so, and it's topical too. You know what I mean?
Okay.
They talk about a lot of really great issues that affect kids today, and that's fantastic. But like just casually, like the main character Christy casually calling another person's parent a psycho because like their parent is strict, very much like Freddie's mom, right? Not to the extent, but like, you know, strict, and it's because like, you know, he lost his wife, and so like there's some trauma there, right? But like actively calling him a psycho because he's acting that way with his daughter is like, it's not okay, right? And that's just something that definitely needs to be addressed. There's Modern Family, and so CJ, sorry about the spoilers.
It's okay.
Where like, you know, the mom who so CJ, I don't know what you know about Modern Family. I'm just gonna give you a rundown. So it's like kind of like, so the patriarch of the family has a new wife who's Latina, who is about the same age as his daughter, right? Who has like the traditional nuclear family with like 3 kids, and then like her brother is the gay man who is in a relationship and they have a baby, right? Or like they have a kid. So that's kind of like the family, right? So, but like they also address that like the patriarch's ex-wife, right? They call her crazy. And like, yeah, she acts in a way, right? But I'm just saying they call her crazy. But it's interesting because like in the very last season, I swear there's like, this is not really a spoiler, but there's, so, Claire, the daughter of the patriarch, right? She is very like, you know, uptight. She can be a little neurotic, but like she says OCD at some point in an episode in the final season. But what's interesting and I didn't expect, right, is like she talks about like this person who's the head of a company who is like a deity for people with OCD, right? And I was just like, immediately I rolled my eyes. But it was interesting because she talked to that person and like somebody had sneezed, and like this person who's the deity for people with OCD sneezed also because she has like the sneezes have to be an even number for her, which was interesting because like I didn't expect it, right? So like maybe like it kind of made me feel a way because like maybe then there's hope yet. Right? Because like they spent most of the time like sort of like just calling people crazy or whatever. But then like in like the last season that happened and I was like, okay, so maybe
Right.
it's not quite there yet, but like it's a step that I didn't expect. And I think that means that like the writers were a little bit more aware of the things that they were writing, which was kind of cool.
Right. And, you know, I think I hope that and we'll talk more about this later, but I hope that as time continues to go on, writers become more cognizant about the importance of portraying mental health correctly. And, you know, I know that if you may be listening and you're wondering, like, why does it even matter? Like, if people just throw around the word crazy, and it really does, you know, words matter. And again, going back, like, media is something, especially these mainstream media, is something that we all are focusing on so often, and so the things that we hear and watch really impact us in ways that we don't even know. And so yeah, it totally matters. And I think it's great that things like Modern Family may, you know, towards the end at least, we're starting to get a good grip on what that means.
I mean, think about it this way, folks. Like, right now it's not like the greatest, but it's like it's a better time to be gay or to be trans, right? Because people are a lot more open to having that conversation and being more accepting of it. Mental health and mental illnesses are still stigmatized to this day, right? It is a huge struggle for anybody with any kind of mental illness to even like talk about it, because to this day it's always like, well, that person had to have been struggling with something, right? If they did something like that was newsworthy, or that person can only be acting a certain way because they're sick, right? And that's just not an okay conversation, right? Because then again, like I said earlier, it makes people feel like they can't open about their struggles, and that they can't be honest with their feelings, and that in general that affects the community at large, right? Because when those people feel like they can't talk about it, then nobody feels like they can talk about it.
Right. And I think that might be a good segue, if you feel like now's a good time to kind of talk. We did a little research prior to this episode of trying to identify and watch a couple of mainstream media things that, kind of the news got around about these things and how they portray mental health. And one of the things that we both took the time to watch in the last few weeks was 13 Reasons Why. And even though they just finished their 4th season, this may be kind of old news for a lot of people. I feel like it's really important to talk about that first season and the impact that it kind of made. The impact that it kind of made. So, I don't know if you want to start, Roselle.
Let's just kind of like start with the things we didn't hate.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, because I'm pretty sure we're about to like rip this apart in terms of like safe messaging and why this is problematic. And yes, I know it's old news, but like what we really want to do here is, like I said, make this conversation easy to digest. Right. And so we're going to really try our best to like make it so much more understandable to the general public who is otherwise not really looking for this conversation.
Right.
So let's just start with the things we didn't hate, right? I think what I really liked about this was like the way that they portrayed, and again, we only watched the first season. Like after that, it was kind of like, do we really want to keep doing this? And I didn't even really finish it. I just kind of started reading the wiki about it, because it was just like, at some point I'm like, okay, tap out. But one of the things I did like was the portrayal of grief in the parents. Right? You have the dad who's just like, he just doesn't know what to do. Right? He's just like, he's been used to like providing for his family, and he's like, now how do I support my wife through this? And it's just like, how can we move on? And then there is the mom who's just like, she needs to know why. She needs to know what's happening. How can I find all of the answers? How did I not see it? Because like any person who has to deal with grief, or like the end of something such as like a relationship, when you're in that position, a lot of the times like you think that you're gonna feel better if you know the reason why, if you know what had happened, or like the reason, like what had gone through that person's mind at the end. And so like I did appreciate that they had done that.
Right. Yeah, I think you make a good point. I honestly hadn't thought too much about that when I was writing my list of things I liked. But no, really, that was a really good portrayal of grief. And of course, grief comes in so many different forms. And we did get to see that in the parents, and even with the people that were closest to the main character, Hannah. We got to see that grief, is reflected differently in different people. And I think grief works hand in hand with mental health, so it is a really good conversation. Something that I did at least appreciate was at the very first episode, they did do that longer, like minute and a half video that was post recorded with the cast to just talk about like, hey, this isn't for everyone. And then they did create that like 13 Reasons Why info website page that they ended up promoting at the end of like every episode, and just on the landing page. So I did appreciate that at least they did try a little bit in that sense.
Did they have it always?
So they did I don't think they had that prior to the show. Like I think that from my understanding of the research that I did, those resources only came after a lot of the backlash that happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's something also important that we're going to kind of get into, is that like having trigger warnings, having resources when you have a show that's as heavy as this and like talks about suicide in a way that it does, like that's super important.
Right.
Especially with media that has to do with like teenagers. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, and just for context, for those who don't really know too much about 13 Reasons Why, basically it was a TV show that Netflix did the first season launched a couple years ago, and it's based off a book. But the whole storyline is that this girl, Hannah Baker, and of course, trigger warning here, and we gave the trigger warnings earlier as well in the introduction, but Hannah Baker dies of suicide. And so the 13 reasons why that where the title comes from is that she leaves like 7 cassette tapes with 13 reasons on the people who she says caused her suicide. And what happened when it was first released, there was just this huge backlash basically from professionals, mental health professionals, parents, teachers, because it was very triggering. It was there's a lot, which obviously we're going to get into, but that's the reason why we're talking about it today, because it had a huge backlash in the mental health community after it started. And I don't know if you have any more good things to share about it before we kind of go into why this happened.
Just the another thing is, so kind of tacking on like how it affected like the people after the fact is, it really portrayed accurately, at least, or pretty well, like the chaos that ensues after a suicide. I think like there are a lot of the questions of what do we do, like there's like the hanging of the posters on the school because that's supposed to like really fix the problem,
right?
Adults suddenly like kind of being on their toes like with everybody, and the teens kind of like receding from that because they never had that kind of attention before. So you know what I mean, like when you suddenly have that kind of attention, you're just like, okay, as a kid, and I understand that, and it really brings home, at least in that regard, why educating like people who are in that position to help teenagers or like anybody struggling, why training education is important for that in regards to mental health. That's why people need to know like what to do when a child is struggling, how to see the signs, and how to effectively act, right?
Exactly.
In a way that isn't going to make the kid feel like they can't, right? Because like,
right.
Teenagers will often be like, no, you don't understand, or no, I can't, open up to you, or no, I don't feel safe. And so you have to like navigating how to figure out how to make those safe spaces for teenagers to talk to you, and how to sort of like prevent suicide in that manner. Like that is so important, because we basically see here like how the system failed, right? Yep. And how it's struggling to figure out what to do after the fact, right? So that, at least there's that, and I think there's a conversation to be had about that.
Yeah. And I think from what I was reading, Netflix wanted to present this series as a way to start the conversation. And I think in some ways it did that, but what we will talk about is that it didn't do it in a safe way. Right. But I did appreciate the effort.
Right. And I think that like if Netflix had like maybe mental health professionals who were specialized in safety training, then maybe we could have avoided a lot of that.
Right. And yeah, that's actually something we can talk about later when we're talking about, things we would like to see.
All of this is very interweaved, so we're just going to be kind of like throwing things in, and then like we'll really get into this stuff. But that's really all I had.
Yeah. Rizal clearly has a little bit more nicer things to say.
I like to, here's the thing, like as a filmmaker, like you often have to train yourself not to be overly critical of things, to like really see things for what they are, and really not necessarily enjoy them, but like look at them objectively. And that's kind of like what I you know, that's what I try to do now.
Yeah.
So, and at least that helped us like figure out like, well, it's not, I mean, no, it's not the greatest, but there was
Right.
something. And like in that, we can at least see the attempt. Right.
Right. And I never, you know, with this whole conversation, we never want to disparage the work that people did, you know. We know how hard it is to make films, and regardless of having a big network behind you, like, it's still a challenge. And so we definitely don't want to disparage the work that got into it. So I appreciate your perspectives on that.
Yeah. All right, CJ, you ready?
Yes, I am ready.
Go.
Oh gosh. So where do I even start? I mean, okay, I don't even know which is my biggest problem, but I think the place that I want to start is just talking about how the entire show, we never hear the word depression. And when you know, I think for even people who don't even know the symptoms of depression well, can probably tell pretty clearly that Hannah has depression. And even though, yes, it's easy to tell that, like, it's important to talk about it. And it should have been talked about in the show because, you know, something I learned when learning about safe messaging and how to present suicide in media, it's like we always learn that, like, suicide is the symptom, you know, not the cause. It's a symptom of the bigger problems. And once we start to frame suicide in that way, it helps us, I think, understand people better and understand people who go through these thoughts and feelings, to know that, like, this isn't just suicide. To those who are thinking about it, aren't just like, it's not just a tool, it's not the problem, it is a symptom of the problem. And I think by not ever once mentioning, like, even casually, even being like, hey, was she depressed, like, not even mentioning it once, I think is a disservice to, you know, the message. Because we need to say words like depression in order to fight that stigma that surrounds it, I think. So I think to start off, that was my one big thing I noticed. And I was waiting every single episode. I was like, are they gonna bring this up? Like, yes, they did at the end, you know, have her go to the counselor, but even the, you know, and I guess that was the point, but even the counselor doesn't bring it up, right? And that to me was a really just a big red flag of them never once trying to get into, like, the mental health of things.
Right. No, yeah, you're absolutely right, because like I didn't even realize it until I was at, I want to say, like, episode, like, halfway through. I was just like, wait, they don't talk about, like, mental health. Right? Like, they don't really talk about, like, mental illnesses, or really, like, they don't really say the words mental health in the thing. So, like, how how is that really supposed to address, like, what she's going through, right? Like, I understand that, like, she dealt with a lot of trauma, right? But that doesn't mean that, like, a person is going to attempt, you know, a suicide, right? It's like trauma that very much exacerbated her symptoms of depression, right? Which led to this. So, like, because, like, as you and I know, a person does not have to experience trauma to be depressed. Anybody can experience trauma, you know, depression. Like, it doesn't matter how good their life is. It doesn't matter, like, where they are, or who they are, right? Any person can experience depression to a point where they think about suicide, right? And I think that by not addressing depression, it does people a disservice. Right? So, go on.
Okay, I can go on. Sure. I was like, do you have anything?
I'll just interject. I'll interject as we go. Go ahead.
All right. I got a whole list, but, you know, I won't take up the whole time just on this one show. But I think, too, what really, the whole thing glorifies and romanticizes suicide, you know? The whole, like, quirky, I'm gonna leave tapes and a map that's hand-drawn. Like, it totally romanticizes suicide. I don't think it hits the point of showing people that this is wrong, you know? It Yeah, it just portrays it in this very like romantic dream typey, artsy way, which I think is not safe at all. Because suicide really isn't like that. And of course I cannot speak for everybody, but from what I understand with suicide and even just my experience with it, like suicide isn't always something that's planned out.
Right.
And with this show, she goes through an entire like series of recording these tapes, and in a way, to me, it felt like the character was kind of using suicide as a tool for revenge, right, against the people
Right.
who hurt her, which I think is a really wrong way to portray suicide, because that is what some people tend to think. They think that
Right.
when someone, you know, attempts to suicide themselves, they think, oh, you're trying, you're just trying to get attention, you're trying to
Right.
do this or that, but that's not it. And I think they even mention it, from what I recall from the show,
Yeah.
in anger. They're like, no, she did this because she's self-centered and all of that. And again, that's just such a wrong portrayal of depression, and of people who attempt to suicide themselves or who do suicide themselves. It's not right. And maybe you will have the outliers who do plan ahead of time and whatnot, but I don't think that it accurately represents you know the reality of what suicide is
Right.
for many people, where it is really like the um you know the last straw for them.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. Because like to me, it immediately comes off as like she's just this angry girl who wants
Right.
people to suffer like she does. And that's not an okay way to think about people who are suicidal. Right?
Hmm.
Is that correct? Is that the way to say it?
Yeah, I think like who want to suicide themselves. And for
Okay.
those who are listening, the reason why it's kind of put in that presentation, and I think we touched about this on a previous
Mhm.
episode, but basically when we say the words like who committed suicide or like
Right.
attempted suicide, it frames it like this is the person, the person's doing something wrong or committing a crime, versus again it being a symptom. And so when we start to reframe it as somebody died of suicide or someone tried to suicide themselves, it takes the blame away from the person, which this show does not do.
Right.
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 The show completely like blames Hannah, blames everybody
Right.
without
Right.
addressing the root cause.
Which is like, there's no, in that case, like, there isn't really a blame to be had, right? Which is like
Right.
the whole thing. And like, again, it just seems the way it frames Hannah as that person, and like the way that obviously the teens are going to react in that way. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
it's not safe for this to be the first show that even talks about suicide,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
as like a focal point, right? It's
Right.
just not an okay thing to do.
Right. Yeah, and kind of building on that, when it comes to safety, like something I've learned with safe messaging is, imaging is really important. And for those who had watched this show, like when it first came out, you may have seen the ending scene where it was a very graphic scene at the last episode of, Hannah's suicide, basically. And that, I think that was one of the scenes that caused one of the biggest outrage. And from my research, there was articles talking about how like Netflix was even warned prior to releasing it that they should not have this scene. They chose to have it and only took it down 2 years after. And it's like a whole 3-minute scene, and like that is 100% the opposite of what safe messaging is, because with safe messaging you're trying to present things in like in a way that is realistic but hopeful, and you never want to you know show actual images of people hurting themselves. And they totally had a 3-minute scene, and that is just not okay.
Can we talk about why it's important not to show people hurting themselves?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and it's because, it images are very triggering for people. And I'll be very, very honest here. I watched this for the first time in the last few weeks in preparation for this podcast, but I avoided it for a very long time because I was worried about my personal reaction. And so like in the last few weeks of watching this, as someone who has, been very aware of her depression for the last 10 years. Obviously, I do a lot of talking about my depression. I found myself triggered with some, oops, sorry, that might have popped. But, I found myself triggered with a lot of the imaging of, there's a scene where very early where you actually like see her arms, and I'm not going to go into detail because that would make this unsafe, this conversation. But even that for me, as like, I'm almost 30, almost 30. And I found that to be extremely triggering because, the images bring up feelings. And so it's super, and like, so I can't even imagine how a teenager who may be dealing with this for the first time, or, a young adult who is struggling with feelings or things like this, how they would feel to see that if I am so far into my journey and still felt so triggered by it, And so, yeah, images are super important because that's what sticks. Like, words are important, but so are images, I think.
So let's kind of talk about also the framing of suicide, if you're good with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the scenes that really, really like made me pause, like just a lot, like I had to stop for a sec, was there's this scene where the other main character, Clay, right? He's sitting with another character like on a cliffside, and the other person asks Clay, he's like, have you ever been to a crime scene? Right? I have. And like they talk about it, right? And he describes what it was like, and then when Clay asks what the crime was, he says suicide. And man, that is like the antithesis of the entire reason why we have this, like, this podcast, right? It's like, once again, we don't want to frame suicide as a crime.
Because it's not.
That's why you don't say committed. Because like it adds to the stigma that, suicide is just like this terrible, like, it's like it's a crime, and like that the people who are struggling with it are thinking about committing a crime, and that's not the same thing at all, right? So let's talk about that. Sorry, like my mumbling kind of threw me off a little bit.
No, it's okay. I got you. Yeah. So when we talk about the way that they frame suicide, I think that it's really, like you said, they frame suicide like it's a crime, and it's not. Suicide is 100% not a crime. It is, again, and I've said it over and over in this podcast, but it again is a symptom. And we have to talk about the things that cause it and the ways that we can prevent it. And I think that's, again, one of my really, really big things about this show, where I'm just like, ooh, this is not good, is that they never share how you can help prevent suicide. This, for like 13 episodes, hour-long episodes, they talk about what caused the suicide and all of these things, but they never once frame how to get help. And for me, like, I really don't think that we, as artists and media people, I don't think we should be sharing suicide stories without sharing how you can then get help. And like they never talk about that. They never talk about like how you can prevent suicide, how they could have helped Hannah. It's always, they turned it into a murder mystery, essentially,
Right, exactly. And like a murder mystery is like not the tone, at least not for a show. To be, to be frank, because like immediately, like when the show started, like with the music and like the narration, like immediately I'm just like, my first thing is like the tone of the show is super weird.
Right.
Why is it doing this like this? Right. And as it went on, it was just like they they didn't frame it in a way that was super constructive to a conversation. It was just like constantly shifting blame. It's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. No, it's her fault. It doesn't have to be anyone's fault. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have to blame anybody. We have to understand what it means to struggle, how to see it, and how can we have conversations that promote healing from it.
Right. And, you know, I think, yeah, like all of that was so right. Because now that you say it, like, yeah, I was actually super uncomfortable, even with just like the intro music. Every time it would play, you're just like, this is not the tone that you should be setting for this kind of conversation. And I think going back to a comment you made where this really was the first big kind of teen show that targets this, you know, that focuses on this message, and it did it so poorly.
It really missed the mark there.
Yeah. And then, you know, I know we don't want to spend our whole time talking about this, but I do just want to, like, after stepping away from this show, I think the biggest thing that really stuck out to me was like, yes, okay, artistry is so important. You know, if you are an artist and this is the kind of story you want to share, I get it that it's super important. I'm an artist too. You know, I really believe in the power of sharing our stories. But I think at some point as artists, we always have to remember that we also have a social responsibility. And I think, you know, Netflix failed their social responsibility when they chose to keep in that scene at the very end, you know, despite the warnings of mental health professionals. And I think the art, you know, and I think as artists we need to remember like how we can't let our artistry be more important than our responsibility to our viewers. And yeah, so I am glad that they took away the scene and that they do have those content warnings, but honestly my hot take is they should just take down the show completely.
I mean, like, this is something, sorry, I was just gonna and this is kind of like something that I've been saying to CJ as we have been preparing for this, is like, if Hannah hadn't died by suicide, then the show would be great, because they deal with everybody else's grief. They deal with everybody else's emotional struggles pretty well. You know, like, they deal with the complexities of what it means to be a teenager and to be like in this like weird headspace and all of these different pressures, like dealing with our parents, dealing with ourselves, right? They do it okay. And like, even with the adults, like with their whole, like, what do I even do? Right. But they don't, you know, ultimately Hannah is the one who dies by suicide. Right. And like, you know, this is a story that's being told from Hannah's perspective. And they don't do Hannah justice by addressing her struggle with depression.
Right, exactly. Oh yeah, it was a good shot, but let's I do not recommend, if you haven't watched it, I hope you do not take this as a sign that you should watch it. I think we should just leave it behind. It's 2021. We want safe messages for our teens.
Right. It's very important to have safe messaging for our teens.
Yeah. And speaking of safe messages, I think we both watched a movie. For you, it's been a repeat, but for me, it's recently that at least I feel like... Okay, we're not done with 13 Reasons Why? That's okay.
No, not 13 Reasons, but I kind of like also want to kind of address like another popular show.
Yes.
Pretty Little Liars. Sorry.
Oh gosh.
I was a big Pretty Little Liars fan in the way that I just like to have it on. I am like a huge like murder mystery fan, but like, have you how much of Pretty Little Liars have you watched? Sorry, just because this is like the bad. Since we're on topic of the bad, let's talk about the bad just a little bit more.
We could stick here for a little bit. So I actually read like the first 13 books.
Shut up.
I was so into it because I, like you, I'm a super big murder mystery fan too. And yeah, so I've read like all 13, 14 books.
How much does it diverge?
So much.
Would you say? Oh, okay.
It's so
just
much.
checking.
So
go ahead.
That's why I actually only ended up watching the first couple of seasons, and the rest I ended up just like reading the wiki summary, because I have a weird thing where like if a book and a movie like or a TV show just don't match enough, like my brain just doesn't want to accept it. So
Okay.
so I ended up reading most of the books but then stopping the TV show. But I watched like I think I watched all the way until like Allison comes back. So that's pretty far, I feel like. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you didn't watch like I mean, you know what happens, right?
Yeah, I know what happens. Yeah,
Okay,
I
so
read
you
all the
didn't
wiki
watch
summaries.
like when they like confronted like Cece or whatever, and we see like her
No,
story.
but I know what that's about. So you
Okay.
you can start, and I'll jump in this time if I have
So
comments.
let's just kind of talk about this because like huge thing in this entire series is the Radley Sanitarium, and that's really what I want to focus on. The Radley Sanitarium. This whole thing perpetuates the stereotype that people who are struggling with anything, really, apparently, right, just get put away. That is not how it works anymore. Generally speaking, and specifically here in Guahan too, is like when somebody has like, like they attempt to suicide themselves or they're like really struggling, they get put in an inpatient, but like it's like a hospital. You get treated and then you leave and you go home and you're fine and you walk amongst other people. But the Radley Sanitarium, apparently, we just lock people up. If they just so much as even like seem to be a little off their kilter, which is like, that's just not okay, you guys.
Yep.
This is not okay.
Yep. Nope, it's not. And now that I think about it, yeah, that was like all very triggering stuff. Like
Yeah.
the the Radley Sanitarium, any of the scenes there, because I do remember like Mono I think was the first person who kind of gets put in there, kind of thing, and yeah, it's so wrong.
And Radley's like this big like piece of this entire show. Like so much happens there, and like they later turn it into a hotel or whatever, and it's like the holder of all the town secrets and stuff. But like,
Right.
man, that's just like it's so problematic.
Right. No, it's so problematic.
And then Mona comes out and she's like, I'm good now. You know what I mean? And like, but then the tone around Mona is like everybody's still suspicious of her, right? It's just like, ma'am, we don't want to show people like struggling like that. You know what I mean?
And yeah, and I guess this is a good moment for those who still think that people with mental illnesses get locked up forever. Yeah, it's a good moment to be like, nope, that's not really the case. Yeah, you're right. We have a lot of like inpatient places, but most of the time it is temporary. It is, it's not meant to be like, you can't just lock up people with mental illnesses.
It's 2021. We have to like undo that.
Yeah, so please let's stop, which kind of just jumping real quick, which brings me into like like Nurse Ratched. Like it is if One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or the new Netflix show Nurse Ratched, which is based off of that. Like, no, that's not a thing anymore. Let's
Right.
just stop. Yeah, let's stop doing movies about those things. Like,
Yes.
like,
Can we stop portraying like mental illness as like the basis for a horror? Like,
yes,
can we
please.
not?
Like, yes, like I cannot count the number of movies that are set in like haunted mental hospitals. Like let's 2021. Let's stop. There's other scary things in this world.
Right.
Yeah. So
we can move on now.
yeah, okay. Cool. All right. Yeah, so tracking now back to the kind of segue into the good things. So I watched for the first time for this podcast Inside Out, which is a Pixar film that I think personally really, really talks about mental health in a really good way. And yeah, Roselle, you were the one who kind of recommended that movie, so I'll let you start first.
Man, I just love Inside Out, right? It about this, girl who's moving, and in her mind are like these 5 different characters right? of her
Yep.
different emotions. There's joy, there's sadness, there's anger, there's, what is the purple guy's name? He's like, what is he, like, panic?
Fear.
Fear, and disgust.
Right.
And so I really love just the way that they characterize sadness. And I feel like joy is all of us.
Right.
Like, as a community, how we feel when we're going through something. It's like, no, shove it down. We have to be happy. We have to be put on a brave face. We have to do all the, this is the emotion. This is like our front. This is our facade. Where sadness is just kind of there, existing, and like, for, joy, the conflict is like, joy is like, no, sadness, you have to stop. You have to stop interfering. You're getting in the way of all of these things, right? And what we later see is like joy accepting sadness for what she is and for her role that there is to play. And that is just such a healthy message for children, right? When they're dealing with their emotions, something like as a parent that like I'm having to learn with my kid is like teaching her how to accept the big feelings that she has, right? She doesn't understand them, and that's kind of like what toddlers, like the big reason for toddler tantrums is like they can't communicate properly and they don't understand their feelings, right? And like for a lot of us, like when we don't learn those things, like we carry them into our adulthood, we carry them into our adolescence, right? When we don't learn what those feelings are and how to process them in a constructive way, right? So as a parent, like I have to figure out how to navigate that so that when she gets older, she can figure out what to do with herself when she's feeling these things, how to accept those parts of her and how to carry it with her and like use them in a way that is constructive, in a way that is like meaningful to her and also to her community if she feels it necessary, right? So I think that Inside Out does this great thing where it's geared towards like a young kids, sorry, kids, right? Really, adults can watch them. It's great for adults too, right? Because then it shows them like it's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel anger, right? It's just like what role do they play, right? We get taught that each emotion has a role in our lives, and it's just about using them, like how do we move forward with them. And I think that like it's just such a great thing, you know?
Yeah, and like you said, this is great for adults too. I'm so happy I finally watched it. I don't know why it took me so long to watch it, but we're not saying that in order to portray mental health safely it has to be in the form of cartoon for kids, like, but I think that what it has to be, it has to be this like to portray mental health in a safe way. Yeah, you have to do something like this where you're talking about things but you're presenting them in a way that's digestible for people. I think I really, just building off of what you talked about, how we're taught like joy, joy is the only thing, that was so important. That is the whole premise of the movie basically, is joy learning that sadness has to be a part of, I believe, Riley. Yeah, Riley's the character's name. And I think that's such an important lesson for mental health because like the first time I was told that like anger and sadness was okay was like when I was sitting in a therapy session at like 25 years old. And like I had never been told that it was okay to not be okay. Like, and it took years of my life to get there. And I think Inside Out is so great because it because obviously the audience is young children, and it tells young children at the very start that it is okay to have these emotions. Like, it is okay, to have joy, to have sadness, to have anger, because it makes you who you are. And by letting only one emotion take control, you're going to set yourself up for failure, which is a lot of what we're taught. We're taught that we're supposed to just be happy and joyful all the time, regardless of what is going on around us. And yeah, so I think it is such a good representation of mental health. And and what healthy mental health looks like.
Yeah, and also like it also talks about like the complexities of your memories, right? Generally speaking, when we look back, we remember the good things, right?
Right.
and only the good things. But what it does is, like, there's a scene where, like, sadness touches the thing, and then she makes the thing all sad, the memory sad, right? But, like, we later see, like, that, you can kind of scroll through it and see the different parts of that memory, like the happy parts of that memory, the sad parts of that memory. And that's kind of like what it is, right? Like, each moment of our lives, there's, like, a complexity to it. Like, it might be happiness spurred from, like, for example, like the scene where it's like her parents, like, comforting her and, like, having a good time with her, like, that was, no, wait, sorry. It was her teammates first, right? It was her teammates.
Yep.
The memory was her teammates, like, happy with her. But, like, before that, it was like she was upset. She was sad, right? And her parents were the ones comforting her, right? So we kind of see that, like, each emotion plays a different part of our memories, and that, like, everything is just so much more complex than, like, the face value of the things that we remember. So I think that was, like, just really important also to portray.
Yeah.
And also talking about, like, her support system also. Like, her parents are, like, yes, they're typical parents. They don't always often see what's happening right in front of them. But, like, they, at the very end of the scene, it was just so powerful the way, like, she just kind of broke down in front of them, and the way that they supported her after the fact. And they're like, we'll get through this together. I miss home too. I'm sorry, I'm about to cry. It was such a good movie.
It is such a good movie. I don't think it's a podcast episode.
Sorry, what?
I was gonna say, I don't think it's a podcast episode if someone doesn't cry.
But it's just like, their parents openly admit to, like, yeah, we miss home too. We understand what you're feeling. We feel it too, and we can get through it together. And that's just such a powerful message. Right, that you're showing to young children who are still trying to understand their emotions.
Right. And I think, kind of building off of that, something alongside of, like, talking about support systems and how it's healthy to have joy and sadness, I really, really appreciated their representation of sadness, and how sadness, wasn't necessarily sad to be sad. It was just who she was, right? Like, she didn't want to turn the memories sad. It was just who she was. And because that's what sadness is, even going deeper, like depression, like, you don't go into the world being like, I'm gonna be depressed. Like, it just sometimes happens. And I think like, what I really appreciated about the portrayal of sadness is, like, sadness was the empathetic one. She was the one who was able to comfort the imaginary friend. I think his name was Bing Bong.
Bing Bong, yeah.
Yeah, she,
Bing Bong, Bing Bong.
Sadness was the one who was able to comfort him. And I think that's a really, really important message, because our ability to empathize with people comes from our ability to be sad and to understand, our own emotions and feelings. And so I thought that was just so powerful. I was like, I can't believe this is a kid's movie, but it's Pixar, right? So it's made for everybody.
Right. And I think that's, like, why it's important to have, like, media like this that is targeted for kids, because, like, because again, it is good for adults. And, like, when you're making kid films, you have to break down complex ideas, right? To make it, like, easy for them to understand. And when you do those things, when you break things down, like, it also makes people who are older, who didn't grow up with those skills and that understanding of things, to also digest it themselves, right? They are less likely to, because, when you get older, like, a lot of the times, like, the things that you feel, the things that you think, they're ingrained, right? And, like, when something comes along and, like, shows you something that is, like, contrary to what you grew up thinking, like, your immediate response is to shut down and reject, right? Like, no, that's not who I am. No, that's not how I grew up, right? But when you reframe it and put it into kids' film, and then you as an adult watch it, then a lot of the time, like, it is easier for you to think about things differently and really reframe your mind when you break it down in a way like that.
Right, exactly. It's just a masterpiece. If there's anything you come away and decide to watch from this podcast, watch Inside Out.
Yes.
Yeah. As they say, it is chef's kiss.
It is so good. So if we're good with that, then we can also move on to something like a film that I watched.
Yes.
Melancholia, also on the good spectrum. And like what put this on my radar was that like I saw a trailer once and then I kept hearing that Melancholia, right? Because I listened to a podcast about depression. It's called The Hilarious World of Depression. Also, I love that podcast. It's basically they reframe like depression as like this sad thing and like kind of like talks about like depression in an accessible way, which I just absolutely love.
Yes.
And they did this episode about like films that do depression right, and like Melancholia is like overwhelmingly accepted as a film that does it right.
Yes.
And it's starring Kirsten Dunst, by the way, and it's just like
Love her.
It was such. What do you know about Melancholia? I don't remember if you read anything about it or.
Yeah, so I read the Wikipedia summary, so I am gonna let you take the lead on this one.
Okay.
Spoilers are okay.
Right. So what I like about this is that like it shows like what the way that other people are kind of like reacting to her, right? And it's just like it's so true, right? The way that people like look at people who are depressed, right? They're just like either seen as a nuisance, somebody looking for attention, somebody who's just like doing it for selfish reasons, but like it's not, right? We see like Justine's like real struggles with like herself and like how she's trying so hard to like this is like it's her wedding day, right? And it's supposed to be like the happiest day of her life, but she just can't. She can't feel it. She just is unable to. And a lot of, depression, when you're like struggling through it, like that's a feeling that you have. You feel like just this numbness, this overwhelming like numbness of like, well, what am I supposed to do with myself, right? And there's like this one scene where like Justine is basically catatonic, where she cannot move, right? And like, her sister has to carry her in, and like I felt that. Like right. I felt that because I felt that. I have been there. There have been times where like I just couldn't do anything. I just didn't have the will to get out of bed. I didn't have the will to do anything, and it's just like, like without really words, we just kind of see her experiences, right? And like we see, it's just the most real that I've actually seen like in an adult film, like of somebody who is struggling with it, which I just felt like was just such an important thing, right? So yeah, I mean, like I did talk about like it being the happiest day of her life, but I think that's like really important, right? Like to portray it on her wedding day, right? Because it is supposed to be a happy moment, and it's not even like about the chaos, right? Because wedding days tend to be chaotic, but it's just her feelings, right? And like all of those things are valid. They're like people telling her that she has to be happy, telling her like she looks great and that she's beautiful, but she just can't. She can't, like, just, in fact, she like self-sabotages, and like in an attempt to like just kind of feel something, she like has intercourse with somebody else in the field, and that's like maybe should I be spoiling this for people? I don't know. Anyway, right? And it's just like, and it's like the thing about like depression is it's just like it's not a logical thing, right? You can't tell yourself, you can't tell another person to not feel depressed. It's just it's there. It's this lingering feeling in you, and I think that the film does like this beautiful way of portraying that. And then like in the second, so the film is kind of in two parts. It's one like focuses on Justine, and then two, it focuses on her sister Claire, who like is super like anxious for a lot of it, and that like really resonated for me because like a huge overarching theme is like the end of the world coming, right? And like how everybody's kind of like dealing with it, right? And so her sister is like super like stressed out. Her like so Justine's brother-in-law and Claire's like husband like dies by suicide because he can't handle it, which is interesting also,
right?
And so like what's really interesting is that how like Justine kind of like walks them through the end of the world, and it's just like, look, it's gonna be, let's just like be together, right? And that was such a interesting thing for me to see also, right? Like how like in the end, like her depression kind of played into it became her strength that carried her
Right.
family through those last moments, which is not really something that you see, right?
Right.
We see it as like a
Yeah.
kind of weakness,
Right.
right? And this thing that's like getting in the way of our lives, right? And that's what we see like in the beginning. It's like it's being portrayed as like the way the characters are seeing it is like this thing that's kind of getting in the way of her own happiness. It's getting in the way of her. But in the end, it becomes like the thing that like that protects her family, like keeps
Right.
her family grounded and helps them through those last moments.
Right. And I think, you know, again, I didn't watch it, but I read the wiki summary. I think that's really awesome to see that the filmmakers, you know, portrayed depression in this kind of sci-fi type film, right? With the end of the world coming because of the, was it like the meteor or the planet or something like that coming?
Yeah, it's like a planet or something.
Yeah, I think that's really an important message too, because it shows that, yeah, we can talk about mental health in a healthy, realistic way, even by using things like, you know, a sci-fi setting or Inside Out, you know? It doesn't always just have to be like straightforward, like, you know, here's a person that, you know, attempted to suicide themselves, things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really wraps up because I don't really think there's like much more to say on Melancholia. I think it's definitely a watch. Like
Yeah.
watch it if you're trying to understand it, but you have to do it with an open mind. Like I feel like a lot of people kind of go into like watching Inside Out or like Melancholia and they see these things and their immediate response is to be like Joy and to be like, you know,
Right.
Justine's family and to be just immediately annoyed. Right, but you can't do that. You have to really understand that big picture of like what it's
Right.
trying to tell you and
Right.
how you can better understand a person who is feeling this way.
Right.
But I do think it does a good job at it.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you have anything else you want to talk about, but if not, this may be a good time to kind of wrap up with
Yeah.
the question of, okay, so now we've talked about the good, the bad, you know, the casual mentions. And I think now a good thing to talk about is like, what would we like to see in media moving forward?
Yeah. That's a good question. And it's so dumb because I wrote it because I didn't even think about it. But man, in general, I really just want to see more films that really portray mental illnesses and mental health in a more complex way, right? The same
Right.
way that Inside Out does it, the way that Melancholia does it. And also like just less casual mention of the word crazy and less
Yes.
of like, I think what I really want to see is what I don't want to see. Right. I no longer want to see like mental health being portrayed as like this terrible thing, like this
Right.
the basis for horror films, right? The basis for like thrillers and mystery.
Right.
And like the basis like and you know like this thing that we can point to when somebody is acting a certain way. Like I don't want to see that anymore.
Right. Agreed. I think, yeah, again, we say this a lot, but the year is 2021 and we don't need that anymore.
Right? We don't need
don't.
that anymore.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, as we kind of reframe, like, we're starting to reframe our thoughts and like into a way that's like more accepting about conversations about trauma, about mental health, and we are. I can see that shift happening in just the community and the way that people talk to each other. We also have to translate that into things that we see in
Right.
in media, in film, in TV shows. We have to absolutely see it. So I just
Right.
need, like, you know, filmmakers need to shift that viewpoint. Don't make the crazy person the butt of the joke. The butt of the joke.
Right. And I think what else I'd like to see, and this is just, you know, kind of a general thing. I want to see more trigger and content warnings, you know?
Yeah.
I've heard the argument made where someone's like, I don't want to put content warnings because it'll spoil it for people. And I was like,
Right.
that doesn't, you know, again, social responsibility is more important
Right.
than your artwork being spoiled or whatever, because we have to do our part as artists to really keep keep our people safe, keep our community
Right.
safe. And we don't want to present things that are triggering to people without giving them a warning or a chance to step away if it's not for them. So,
Right.
on just like a logistical level, trigger and content warning, so important. And it's been
Right.
great to see a lot of the younger generation, I notice, are very good about that,
Yeah.
about putting those content warnings. And so I think Hollywood and even the theater scene, we all need to catch up with
Right.
making sure we warn people about what's going to be talked about, for
Right.
sure.
Right. Filmmakers too,
Yes.
like CJ and I are like qualified to say this as creatives who like are
Right.
working to create more art that like that talks about mental health and mental illnesses. Like, y'all, this is something that we need to do for ourselves and for our community.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and I really want to see more artists, filmmakers, theater people. I want reaching out to mental health professionals when they're going to tackle
Yeah.
mental health. That's with my theater company Breaking Wave, we do a show about mental health every year, and every year we reach out to the mental health professionals on island, and they are like the nicest people, who are so like, if you are on Guam and you're a creative wanting to tackle this, do not be afraid to reach out to Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center and the Peace Office, because they have resources. If you want to learn more about safe messaging, a quick Google search will get you there. But also, mental health professionals who are always willing to talk about these things, because we're all in this
Yeah.
together. We want to portray
and you
media.
learn a lot
Yeah.
by talking to them about it.
So that's what I would like to see. Let's all work together to make media that portrays mental health.
Sorry, just thought of another thing, right? So,
Yes.
as the daughter of somebody who was diagnosed with like obsessive compulsive disorder and bipolar disorder, I just want to see like more people like portray just any like mental illnesses like properly. Like, I
Right.
really want to see a more accurate view of what it means, and also like just in regular stuff. You know
Right.
what I mean? It doesn't have to be like a film specifically about whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be a film about bipolar disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder. It doesn't have to be specifically about that. It just needs to be about people existing in the same space as other people because they do. Right? They walk amongst you. They are around you. They are probably serving you at your favorite restaurant or, store, or like maybe they're your coworker in the office, and like that's
Right.
just so important. Like seeing it in an environment where you think that you won't see it, that's so important.
Yes. Yeah. Let's portray realistic stories, but let's also make them hopeful. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's what I want to see, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that about wraps it up today. I know we went on some rants, but I hope that you all took a little bit about this. If you ever wanted to talk about safe messaging, Roselle and I are open doors and can help lead the way there. So thank you again for joining us today, and stay tuned for more.
Bye.
Bye.
Special thanks to Andrew Speed for sound editing, mixing, and creating our intro music. In honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, we'll be releasing new episodes of Everything's Cherry every Wednesday for the entire month of May. So don't forget to listen, find our visual podcasts on YouTube, and follow us on Instagram at Everything's Cherry Guam. If you want to come on the show, send us a DM or email us, or you can send us voice notes on Anchor and we'll play it on the show. Our aim with this podcast is to have important conversations about mental health, but we understand that the feelings brought upon through this exploration may sometimes linger. If you're looking for support and healing surrounding your experiences, the following resources are available and accessible for you. There's the Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center 24-hour crisis helpline at 647-8833 and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.